Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Pacific Council on International Policy. Today, we have an all-star panel assembled to discuss the current state of Arctic security, Greenland sovereignty, and transatlantic concerns over the U.S. approach to the region, particularly after what many are now calling the Greenland crisis from earlier this year. My name is Jason Moyer. I am the program director for the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Washington, D.C., and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Transatlantic Security Initiative. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. To set the stage, since returning to office and even in the run-up to his inauguration, President Trump and members of his administration have placed renewed emphasis on Arctic security. The Arctic has always been vital to U.S. national security interests, particularly during the Cold War. Since then, the Arctic has nevertheless remained a priority, although it often was relegated lower on the list amidst more pressing global concerns. Now, the Arctic has been thrust from the backstage to the center stage. The tone and approach to the region has shifted significantly. The president's rhetoric towards the Arctic now has a focus on the United States gaining territorial control over Greenland. Greenland, with a population of approximately 57,000 people, is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark is a founding member of the NATO alliance and a lockstep ally in facing global security challenges, particularly in Afghanistan, where Danish losses per capita were among some of the highest amongst coalition partners. Copenhagen retains responsibility for foreign affairs, defense, and monetary policy for Greenland, although the territory of Greenland has increasingly become autonomous through the Home Rule Act in 1979 and the Self-Government Act of 2009. President Trump's push for U.S. control of the semi-autonomous territory of Greenland reached a boiling point earlier this year with threats of tariffs on European allies, and he refused to rule out the use of military force. European capitals uniformly reject any transfer of sovereignty, and the people of Greenland overwhelmingly reject offers to become part of the United States, with one poll by a Danish newspaper finding 85% of the population oppose and only 6% are in favor of joining the United States. So why is the United States interested in Greenland? Greenland's geographic importance cannot be understated. It is both a significant presence in the Arctic, but also in the North Atlantic. Greenland played a vital role in World War II as a refueling hub and listening post. Today, the United States maintains the Pituffik Space Base on Greenland. It is the United States' northernmost base and also provides strategic surveillance and detection capabilities against ballistic missiles. Russia views the Arctic as a strategic theater and has invested more than any other nation globally into its Arctic military capabilities, bases, and maintains its northern fleet in the Kola Peninsula. China has declared itself a near Arctic state and has an eye towards the economic potential of the region as new shipping routes become available for longer stretches of time during the summer. A small but record-setting number of cargo vessels made the perilous journey along the northern sea route last year, shaving valuable time off of traditional shipping routes. Additionally, Greenland has a wealth of natural resources, including rare earth materials, although access to these deposits is economically and logistically challenging. Greenland, as they like to say, has and remains open for business. Despite the geopolitical focus of the Arctic region by the administration and the media, I do want to emphasize that what's happening in the Arctic is a story shaped primarily by climate change and the people who are living there. The Arctic is warming nearly 4 times faster than the global average, with many of the new shipping routes hyped up by commentators only available for limited windows during the year. And they remain quite treacherous. The people living in the Arctic have valuable insights and lived experience rooted in the realities of the region that often elude policymakers in capitals. By not acknowledging the full nature of the changes to Arctic climate taking place in the region, we risk simplifying the on-the-ground realities or viewing the Arctic only through a narrow lens of geopolitics and security. My hope is that with global attention elsewhere at the moment, and with a little time and distance from the Greenland crisis earlier this year, we can cut through some of the noise and try to answer some of the pressing questions regarding U.S. interests in the Arctic, the future of Greenland sovereignty, and how our European allies view U.S. interests in the Arctic region. We really have the perfect panel for this. Very much looking forward to hearing their thoughts. And with that background out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed panel. I'll provide a short introduction for each of them and then ask them to provide 3 to 5 minutes of prepared remarks before we open the conversation to a moderated Q&A. We have time towards the end of the webinar for questions from the audience. You can use the Q&A function, which at any time to ask questions of our panelists throughout the course of the discussion. First, I will turn to Dr. Esther Brimmer. Dr. Esther Brimmer is the James H. Binger Senior Fellow in Global Governance at the Council of Foreign Relations. She is writing a book on the need for better governance mechanisms to manage expanding human activities in outer space, which I do hope we'll have a little bit of time to talk about. Most recently, she served as project director for CFR's new task force report, Securing Space, a Plan for U.S. Action. She previously served as project director for a different CFR task force report titled Arctic Imperatives, Reinforcing U.S. Strategy on America's Fourth Coast. Her career spans service in government as a senior official, as a CEO, and as a faculty member at leading universities. Without further ado, Esther, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here and thank the Pacific Council, and I look forward to our discussion of the Arctic. It brings together so many interesting issues, so I'm delighted to have this conversation today and look forward to the discussion we will have. The Arctic, as you have already indicated, is a fascinating region, an enormous region, which includes, of course, a United States state, Alaska. U.S. citizens live here. It's also extraordinary because we share it with several other countries, including the Russian Federation, which has over half the coastline in the Arctic area. And for many years, this area often benefited from what was low tensions in the high north, but obviously that has changed. I would suggest that the situation in the Arctic sits at the intersection of at least 5 different trends. The first is great power competition in global spaces. We're seeing that worldwide, whether in the oceans, we're seeing it in outer space, and we're writing about that as well, but particularly in the Arctic as well. Sometimes driven by technological change, but first, the return of great power competition in global spaces and command of those global spaces being seen as important. The second trend I would flag would one that you've already mentioned, the dramatic pace of climate change. As you've already indicated, that the Arctic is warming much faster than the rest of the globe, and that is having implications for transportation and other aspects. And so in our conversation, we can also talk about the impact of climate change, but this is one of the major issues. It's also shaping the politics in the Arctic. The third I would flag is actually created by the dramatic impact of climate change, and that's transportation. That in a world that, despite all of the challenges we face, is still deeply interconnected economically as well as culturally and in many other ways, but that we should remember that 80% of the world's goods move by sea. And so that basically all countries are interested in understanding how goods can be moved through the maritime spaces. And so the warming of the Arctic has opened some interest in the ability to move goods through the Arctic as a faster way of travel than elsewhere. But as has already been indicated, remember, this is not open. This is that at some point in parts of the summer, there may be possibilities for passage. And some countries are trying this out. In 2025, China sent 14 container ships through the Arctic. One note in particular was a ship called the Istanbul Bridge, which is a Chinese container ship that went from China to a port in the United Kingdom called Felixstowe along the Northern Sea route, which follows the Russian coast, in 20 days. In last October 2025. The same trip would have taken between 40 and 50 days through the Suez Canal. Also, other countries are beginning to look at the opportunity of transiting through the Arctic, or still recognizing that it's extremely difficult. For example, South Korea is planning to send a ship from Busan to Rotterdam to also test this route. So that's another trend, is the curiosity about the opportunity for transportation through the Arctic. The fourth trend I would flag is a larger one that comes up in almost every issue we're looking at in international relations these days, which is the return of China. And I think just as a perspective, when we think of the role of China as a major world power, we have to then take a longer view. And remember, I call it the return of China after 250 years of Euro-Atlantic dominance. And so the intersection between China's new strategic frontiers policy, which has been around for well more than a decade, but which looks at space, polar, oceans, cyberspace in an integrated way. China's had an Arctic policy since 2018, and it has important research stations in both poles, but I'll flag both the Arctic and the Antarctic, but I would flag particularly it has a research station in Svalbard. And just an interesting point that, of course, that Greenland exports fish to China, and in fact exports more fish to China than to any other country. The fifth trend, that I think we see, that global trend that we're also seeing in the Arctic, is the importance of middle powers. Those countries that are not the two or three great powers out of worldwide reach, but countries that have strong diplomats, are part of alliances, are economically important, and the Arctic region has many of those important middle powers, including Canada, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. So we may talk about that as well. In our conversation, we also we'll talk particularly about the extension and activities of NATO, and even to say that the United States has had a long-term interest in the Arctic as well, including in the 20-year project of measuring the extended continental shelf. The United States has many interests in this region, and I will be able to delve into particularly how these are seen in the latest challenges faced by the Greenland crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating. I very much appreciate, the way you contextualize China as kind of the return of China after this Euro-Atlantic dominance. I think that's very helpful, and I think we might get into more of that as we continue. But now I'd like to turn to my colleague at the Atlantic Council, Dr. Justina Budginaite-Froehly. She's a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Europe Center and Transatlantic Security Initiative within the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Her professional focus is on security and defense-related issues, including defense industrial developments, military mobility, and energy security in Europe. She previously worked at the Ministry of Defense of the Republic of Lithuania and the Defense Policy Planning Department. Without further ado, Justina, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to join this discussion. So I'd like to start maybe with a small disclaimer. As a European, I'm of course very much interested in Europe's success in navigating those geopolitical storms that are unfolding. But at the same time, I think that what Europe needs is not comforting rhetoric, but hard truths and candid discussion about the issues. Because reassurance may feel good in difficult situations, but it rarely drives progress. That's why I would like to start here my intervention by saying that, or repeating what I recently published on Greenland and on this crisis, so-called crisis, that Greenland is actually Europe's strategic blind spot. This is an uncomfortable observation somehow, but at the same time, I think that from the European perspective and how it has approached Greenland over decades, we could see that it was an administrative matter between Copenhagen and Nuuk. At the same time, we see that the world around has changed dramatically. The broader Arctic, with Greenland as a part of that, has turned into a theater of geopolitical competition. We have Russia, as already mentioned, which is very actively building its military capabilities in the Arctic, around the Kola Peninsula, where it stores most of its second strike nuclear capability, around ports that are being built and rebuilt for its northern fleet. At the same time, we have China, which is very much interested in infrastructural and economic partnerships across the region, and which uses its connection with Russia and Russia's vulnerabilities actually at the moment as other conflicts in the world unfold to enter the Arctic region in a sustainable way and to stay there for long. So I think what we see China doing is, as it has done in other regions, using investment, using infrastructure as a way to creep into it, terming it as a dual use, terming it, the infrastructure as something for scientific research, but actually being a cover for a potential military involvement in the region. At the same time, when we look at Greenland, we cannot deny that the location of this island is strategic, right? We have the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, which is that spot to track maritime activities between the Arctic and the Atlantic Oceans. And I mean here, of course, not only conventional shipping, but also Russia's nuclear submarines and tracking how they proceed from the Arctic potentially into the Atlantic. At the same time, as already mentioned, the United States has military installations in Greenland. It had more in the past. It has now one main Pituffik base, which is crucial for missile early warning and which directly feeds into US homeland security. So it cannot be denied that Greenland is central to transatlantic security. At the same time, I think that Europe's approach to Greenland for a long time rested upon the premise that the combination of Danish sovereignty, of NATO membership, of legal frameworks are enough to provide for stability and security in and around Greenland. But unfortunately, geopolitics doesn't follow this logic, and especially it doesn't follow this logic in a region as the Arctic is, which is thinly governed and a high-stakes region, so to say. So I think if Greenland economic development remains fragile, if infrastructural gaps persist, if Europe doesn't engage more actively, other actors will inevitably try to fill that space, and we see that happening. So the real question for me is whether Europe is ready to take its own Arctic responsibilities and the chances actually connected to these responsibilities seriously. And here I just want to stress three things. The first one is that it's crucial to recognize that Greenland stability and development are not only Denmark's responsibility, but European strategic interest. Second, that Europe needs to increase its footprint in Greenland in terms of infrastructure, in terms of ice-capable vessels, in terms of maritime surveillance, which would allow for sustained presence in the Arctic and for power projection. And third, and my last point, is that stronger European role doesn't mean competition with the United States. Even today, even with the crisis that we've seen, I think quite the opposite is true. If Europe takes the Arctic and Greenland more seriously, it would help balance the transatlantic relationship and make it more sustainable. I'll stop here and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Justina. I really appreciate you bringing the European perspective to this particular set of issues. You started by saying that, there's a need for harsh truths, and I think, this particular flashpoint in the transatlantic relationship did show that there's considerable work to be done regarding, kind of strategic interests when it comes to Greenland and the Arctic more broadly. I'd like to next turn to our third panelist, Iris A. Ferguson. She's the president and founder of IAF Strategies and a non-resident senior associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. She most recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Arctic and Global Resilience from 2022 to January 2025. In that role, she advised the Secretary of Defense and senior department leadership on protecting U.S. homeland and allied interests in the Arctic region, oversaw oceans policy and the Freedom of Navigation program to uphold the maritime rules-based order, and addressed strategic resilience risks, including critical minerals and energy security. I don't know how you managed to do all of that in 3 years, but really kudos. Over to you, Iris.
Thanks for putting together this panel, and thanks for the great remarks of the previous two panelists on kind of giving some overarching trends and also talking about some of the European strategies. And I'm hoping that we can dive into a little bit more of that going forward. Yeah, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about how the Department of Defense thought about and thinks about Arctic security, because it's a little bit of a different lens than the other panelists. As you mentioned, Jason, I had the privilege of being able to stand up a totally new office back in 2022 dedicated to thinking about Arctic security and the other topics that you mentioned, which were significant. And yeah, it was a beast to build a new DASD office, but just also an immense privilege. And so just the fact that we stood one up to that focused on Arctic security was obviously a huge testament to the importance that the DoD certain places and placed on the region. Its strategic terrain has been talked about. It's critical for missile defense. It's a place of power projection, but uniquely, especially for the Department of Defense, it's really a bridge between the Indo-Pacific, between Europe and the United States. It's a place where you see all of these converging interests, the Chinese, Russian, Arctic ally, NATO interests, all kind of converging at once. And it's also a geographic platform from which to get to these other theaters. So I hope that we can continue to force people to look at the world from the top down to understand the geographic uniqueness of the Arctic region. So when I was at the Pentagon, we had a couple of assumptions about the Arctic region. One, that it's becoming increasingly competitive, but conflict is certainly not inevitable. Two, that the region is changing rapidly and that it would continue to change rapidly. We saw our primary competitor as China and the increasing interest from China, as Esther so rightly kind of laid out, various interests in governance and making investments and putting up different types of scientific vessels in really unprecedented numbers from what we'd seen in the past. We also saw an increasing investment from Russia that despite the invasion of Ukraine and the attrition that they've experienced in Ukraine, they still have quite a lot of interest and investment going into the Arctic region and bolstering their interests. Really, from a Department of Defense perspective, they're more of an acute challenge and that they consistently try to demonstrate their ability to hold our assets at risk, certainly in and around Alaska. And then, of course, that the environment was going to continue to change, that the climate is warming and it's impacting our operations, it's impacting our adversaries' operations, and also impacting how we need to be responding in the region. Our priorities were fourfold. One, not going to war, as I mentioned, keeping the region stable and peaceful. Two, deterring aggression and defending the homeland. And three, really working on our awareness and domain awareness in particular. There's lots that's been written, including, and I believe in Esther's report back in 2016, talking about the challenges to domain awareness and our ability to see effectively, do we have the right architectures to see threats, to be able to communicate, do we have the right weather sensors? We spent a lot of time outlining various investments that we could put in place to improve our domain awareness. And then lastly, our strategy was anchored in allies and partners. The Arctic is very hard. I'm sure we'll get into this. It's very expensive and tricky to navigate. But luckily for the United States, our allies and our Arctic allies have exquisite capabilities and expertise. And so we spent a significant amount of time engaging with them. We actually created a very specific forum for us to discuss Arctic security issues because one didn't exist before for me to talk to my counterparts at the time. And we treated them with immense respect for the capabilities that they could bring to bear, but also where we could collectively be investing in together. So those are a little bit of the highlights of how I think the Department of Defense has been thinking about the Arctic. And I know that we're going to talk about a little bit more about present day and look forward to that.
Thank you so much, Iris. And in addition to your time at the Pentagon, since leaving office, you've been a terrific voice on all things Arctic. So I just really want to thank you for joining us today and for continuing to share your insights with the wider audience. Um, uh, to kind of get back to two of the points that Esther and Justina raised, the question of governance came up. Is there enough of a governance structure in the Arctic, or do you think that there's potentially room for improvement there? Um, Iris talked about how she needed to create this framework for dialogue with some of our European Arctic allies. Is there room for improvement here? Esther, what do you think? And then Justina.
So first, thank you to all the other panelists for the exchange of ideas and the additional information that we can delve into. I would just take a moment to talk a little bit about some of the governance in the Arctic, and that what is maybe surprising for some is that we have a mechanism for discussing Arctic issues, but it does not discuss national security issues. So the Arctic Council is a body that initially had 8 members, including the Russian Federation, which had a rotating chair position. The United States was chair a few years back, and the idea is that it looked at that it brought states together to look at issues important to the people living in the Arctic. It was not only did they talk about so traditionally foreign ministry sorts of things. But it was also remarkable because of the participation of important groups representing full indigenous communities across the Arctic as well. And so it was one of the few places where non-state actors actually had a seat at the seat of the table. So that mechanism is good for discussing many Arctic issues, but not national security issues. And so that the place where I see the national security conversation happening is in the NATO context. So that then the question is then what other mechanisms have to be created, as Iris has indicated, because we're now having to address these national security challenges in the Arctic region.
Yeah, and I think, Justina, did you want to come in on this?
I wanted only
Yeah.
to second on that indeed, when it comes to security and defense, we have this blank space where everything is possible. And of course, every possibility to fill the gaps and vacuums are being used. So just wanted to second to what Esther has said, that this region is indeed very prone to great power competition because of that, because of the changing environment, right? And the space is opening and the lack of the rules to govern it.
Thank you. And I think one positive aspect that came out of, this Greenland crisis earlier this year is that NATO has responded by launching Arctic Sentry, a 12-month-long multi-domain military joint mission. This is meant to be an opportunity to improve and integrate NATO's Arctic know-how. Traditionally, a lot of this work has been spearheaded by Norway. What do you hope are some of the lessons NATO as an alliance takes away from this series of exercises?
One aspect, and of course I'll defer to others, I actually knows much more about the Department of Defense, but I will say one of the important factors about the NATO alliance indeed is the planning together process, and so that you regularize the types of interactions. And of course there were existing exercises. There was cold response, which I could take as 32,000 people from 14 NATO countries. I think they're wrapping up today. I think I saw that it's March 9th through 19th. That existed. Arctic Edge has met, I believe, since 2018, and that this year the exercises were in both Alaska and Greenland. So there were some existing structures, but indeed, as you say, the Arctic Endurance and Arctic Sentry are some new aspects of that. The other was, and I spotted this, and others may want to comment who knows DoD better than I do, but I mean, I was interested to see that in December of last year, that the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe has placed Denmark, Finland, and Sweden to be coordinated out of Norfolk, out of Virginia. So it's just an issue of rethinking within NATO about where and how certain of the coordination is occurring. So there are interesting things that are happening that structurally support allies cooperation related to Arctic issues that may be of interest.
Yeah, I'll jump in on some of the broad trends, and Esther was noting some of the bureaucratic process challenges that are happening in NATO that are a testament to Finland and Sweden joining NATO several years ago. So the architecture of NATO is kind of catching up to the fact that it has new territory to protect and to think about and to leverage in some ways. And you're seeing a couple of different shifts in that direction. I think one is what Esther mentioned, that Sakir, the commander at EUCOM and that oversees part of NATO, has made an intentional effort to put the Nordic countries into one operational command out of JFC Norfolk. So that allows for more cohesion. It allows for more operational consistency. It allows for greater clarity on exchanges of lessons and opportunities. It also sends a signal around capability development and capability advocacy. One of the challenges in the past at NATO is that some of the Arctic investments would not be counted towards the national contribution limits that we often hear about in the news of 2%, 5%, et cetera. But with this change and the potential change of regional plans, that would allow for greater emphasis, or at least some emphasis, on the Arctic region. You could see that Arctic investments could go towards some of these national contributions, which will be a big sea change in terms of capabilities, I think, that we would be able to see out of some of our Arctic countries. I hope that Arctic Century is able to, one, kind of point to where there's gaps, right? Have some honesty around where we really need to be making investments, not kind of have a hand-wavy ideas around what we need for Arctic security, but really get to some brass tacks around where do we need infrastructure, where do we need presence, what kind of capabilities do we share, what kind of common operating pictures do we really need to be leaning into as an alliance. And to Justina's point around kind of hard truths, I think this is one of the areas where it's been actually really refreshing to see European capitals, but certainly Arctic capitals, really step up to define what is of interest to them into protecting their own interests. Having sat on the other side of the table in the US, there was a lot of deference given to the United States. It was a privileged position to be in, quite frankly, as the United States. There are a lot of people that want to listen to what the United States needs and wants and how they can collectively add on to that. But I think we're at a moment now where many nations are defining for themselves, rightfully so, what they need, which actually ends up helping the collective more. And so I've been really encouraged to see a lot of the investments that have been announced in Canada, in Norway, in Finland, and Sweden, and basically all of the Arctic capitals that are really helping define for themselves what they need.
Yeah, I would only shortly add to those lessons learned from the Arctic Sentry ongoing operation. So I think there is a lesson learned for Europe, for the United States, and for NATO. So for Europe, definitely, as Iris said, better understanding about the operational environment, about the infrastructure needed for further planning of European presence in the Arctic. For the United States, I think, again, just to repeat someone who already told that showing that the European nations actually are those ones with the know-how of how to operate in the Arctic, and that partnership and partnering with the Europeans is actually of huge interest to the American side. So again, to stress a little bit that transatlantic partnership indeed in the Arctic. And for NATO, of course, each and every mission, each and every exercise, it improves the interoperability of the allied forces. So this is already a very positive aspect in itself, so to say. But it also, of course, gives new impulses, also for defense innovation, for example, to improve the Arctic capable military equipment, right? Because I think that, as we said, the Arctic is opening, and we do not only have access to Greenland, let's say, but also through the Baltic states up north, right, through the new NATO members, Sweden and Finland. So I think in this area, the more we are actively engaged and operating in that environment, the more we learn, the better we learn of how to do it more wisely, smarter, quicker, and how we can kind of preempt our adversaries in kind of dictating the trend.
Yeah, and this is something I know, Justina, you've written a lot about how much Sweden brings to the NATO alliance. I just want to foot stomp those, your comments as well. Finland and Sweden both have significant experience operating in the Arctic as Arctic states. Finland, of course, has this icebreaker know-how that it brings into the NATO alliance. I think that's really something to underscore. And then, of course, we talked about the Joint Force Command in Norfolk. It's actually, I believe, in the process of being transferred to the United Kingdom. So there's also an interesting element there to watch as, there's some structural changes within that Joint Force Command. So continue to watch that space. But just to kind of pivot towards, you all touched on Russia and China in some regards in your opening remarks. In your estimation, how concerned should U.S. policymakers be about Chinese and Russian activity in and around the Arctic? I do want to flag that, there are claims that Chinese vessels around Greenland, those have often been exaggerated, but we are seeing an increase in Coast Guard cooperation between both Russia and China, and they've conducted joint drills near the Bering Strait, not far from Alaska. With that being said, how concerned should U.S. policymakers be about Russia and China? And also, Justine, if you want to talk about European policymakers as well.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my underlying idea when I hear that kind of question is always to say, it's okay if there are no Chinese and Russian ships now, but we shouldn't wait until there are some. So there should be measures being employed in order to preempt that or to prepare ourselves, not allow to dictate always and just only react, right, to what we encounter in that region. So as you already mentioned, I think that the Russian and Chinese presence is more concentrated at the moment at another part of the Arctic, not necessarily around Greenland, right? But again, just to stress that doesn't mean that no action is needed now from the European and American side. So I think the basic idea is precisely that, and in order to kind of step up for the Europeans and for the Americans, I think it's also maybe necessary to mirror what the Chinese and the Russians are doing. Indeed, again, I repeat, the infrastructural development, right? It starts from there. We know that if you want to facilitate Greenland, you cannot just go tomorrow and build something great there, right? Because you have those harsh conditions. You need ports, you need airports, you need and you need to build that under like really minus temperatures and really harsh conditions. So I would say that everything starts with infrastructure, and we can move from there further, right?
I would also express concerns, and to say that indeed that we do need to be concerned, I think, particularly about what China will be doing in the Arctic. Again, there are open waters in the Arctic. They can, everyone's allowed to sail there. However, I would just note that we are seeing some and only few, but still, we are still seeing some of the types of exercises that we've seen in the South China Sea, in that we've seen that China has at least had a ship that was sailing over the extended continental shelf, which the United States has declared. And so so obviously the U.S. Coast Guard is having to keep busy to keep an eye on this. And so the types of shadow operations that we see in other areas are appearing at places in the Arctic, and I think continue to raise concerns. We should also recall that, of course, what at least used to be Russian sanctioned oil and other things were again moving in the Arctic. At times China has facilitated that as well. So we need to be concerned and vigilant.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think some of it depends on where you sit. And on the European side of the Arctic, as Justina was so well articulated, I think if we can divide and conquer, if we look at the Arctic as an area to keep stable and to try to deter activity we don't want in, if we can have the Europeans step up in the European side of the Arctic and be really vigilant there, it helps free up the United States to be thinking about some of the challenges that they're seeing off the Indo-Pacific side, which are a little bit more tangible. When I would talk to some of my counterparts, this was several years ago, before more of the Chinese activities was more well known, they were aghast to hear that China was even operating in the Arctic region, let alone that China and Russia were cooperating together. It has taken a lot of intentional conversations to, I think, have there be an appreciation that the threat environment is different and that there are different tools to respond. The challenge on the Indo-Pacific side is that there aren't that many people to call, right? Although the US is part of NATO, in theory, this could be a place where our European allies would also show up for us. It's quite far away. And I think just mentally it's a hard leap for folks to make that it's connected, but it really is if you look at the top down, but it feels far away for European capitals. So on the Indo-Pacific side of the Arctic, where we have significant US infrastructure, we have some of our largest concentration of forces to flow into the Indo-Pacific out of Alaska, where we have a significant seam between NORTHCOM, who controls North American Homeland Defense, and INDOPACOM, which controls the Indo-Pacific, and also the European Command, where there's a seam that our adversaries clearly know about. When we see activity by the two of them happening there, arguably in larger numbers with greater intention than anywhere else in the world, it absolutely should give us pause. How much is the alliance in reality? Unclear, right? It's unclear how much of this is just temporal or how symbiotic it really is. And I don't want to suggest that it's a deep alliance. Flying together in circles is not an alliance. We know what it takes to build an alliance. So I don't want to overstate it, but we absolutely should be keeping tabs on that for our interests.
Great, thank you. And just to kind of keep on with this theme of Russia, the war in Ukraine is continuing without an end in sight. Does this focus on Arctic security detract from the kinetic conflict happening on NATO's doorstep? And how should the Arctic rank in NATO's very many priorities? Esther, please.
So although the war in Ukraine continues, and that there are fundamental principles that we must continue to defend in that area, that I actually don't think it actually distracts from the addressing of these issues. I'm more concerned now about Iran distracting. That's a different story. But I think that understanding both the issues in Ukraine and looking at the Arctic and northern parts of the globe can be compatible, and recognizing how closely intertwined the security is amongst North America and Europe, and being reminded of that and that we will need each other in different places, I think does reinforce the fundamental principles that underlie the alliance.
Yeah, I agree with what Ezra's saying, and I also think it's just to reiterate the bridge concept that these are not separate theaters in some ways. They are so connected, and I think people forget that even now that the reason why Russia is still able to execute its war in Ukraine is because China is bankrolling a lot of the projects for them in the Arctic, right? They are actually inextricably linked because of the ability for Russia to try to take these resources from Russia and to give them money. It helps Russia then and continue to invade in Ukraine. So it might be different drivers, economic versus military, but they are inherently linked.
I would only add that I think fully agree that the theaters are interconnected, but like this rhetoric around Greenland, I think what it did perhaps is that it gave some food for thought for the Russians, for Putin, in kind of checking for the potential cleavages within the alliance. So I think this was the worst part of this whole thing, I would say, that, some of our adversaries, they were paying attention to that and checking what that could potentially mean, and where is there a verge between the partners and how that could be exploited. On the other hand, when it comes to Ukraine, I think it's also important to stress that the West hasn't been that focused on that issue too as it should have been. Like, I mean, the war is ongoing for so many years already, and actually having started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, which actually required a hard response in order to preempt everything else what happened thereafter. So, you know, when it comes to the European response, to the European American response, I'm of that opinion that saying, you know, we are supporting you for as long as it takes is already a false phrasing in itself. We were afraid of the defeat of Russia. We are most probably still afraid of that, and I think this is a mistake.
May I just inspired by my colleagues' comments, just to mention just two other things that to say that about the Ice Pact, which for building Arctic security cutters, which brings together the United States, Canada, and Finland, and drawing on the icebreaking expertise of Finland and the knowledge of Canada and the participation of the United States. And that's extraordinary. That would not have happened in a different context because of the long, complicated issues related to shipbuilding. And so I think that's interesting, and that continues. You know, there's a little concern this year, but that seems to be continue. So I think that's remarkable. The other is that the war in Ukraine leads to the expansion of NATO with two highly capable Arctic states. Again, they would not have been formal allies, and Finland, of course, had been in unique position since the late 1940s. Sweden had been neutral for 200 years. It had been neutral since the Napoleonic era. This is an enormous change for them, but which then also changes the relationships, and so that there are profound aspects to this, which will be part of our sort of diplomatic map, for decades to come.
Yeah, I fully agree. The Swedish defense minister likes to call, the decision for Finland and Sweden to join NATO as a result of Russia's further invasion of Ukraine, the mother of all unintended consequences. And I think that really kind of captures, exactly what you were just alluding to. As a reminder, feel free to leave questions in using the Q&A function. Questions are open. We'll turn to your questions shortly. But just to kind of continue on this theme, European leaders are rethinking relations with the United States after this year's Greenland episode, which very badly shook confidence in the transatlantic security relationship. From each of your perspectives, how do you think European leaders view the reliability of the United States as a security partner? Especially this year, we've already seen the U.S. incursion in Venezuela, situation with Greenland, and now the ongoing conflict in the Gulf with Iran. Maybe Iris, we can start with you, and we'll go Justina and then Esther.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can only look at the news to see that there's a trust deficit that I think exists right now across the Atlantic at times. And I think Greenland has been, at the forefront of that conversation. That being said, I'm actually writing a paper on this right now. I genuinely think that there's more dependence that we have on one another that will transcend this political moment. I think the Arctic is a unique place because of that. It's a place where no country, including the United States, they don't have the privilege of going it alone. And we have real needs on one another, whether it be for operating in the region or access and basing or being able to see threats meaningfully in different parts, or on building capabilities together with, say, Ice Pact as a great example of leveraging one another's capabilities to help benefit the United States. So I think collectively, we still all need each other inherently for our own interests and for the stability of the broader region. And so I think that'll endure past this political moment.
I think that it's, you cannot approach Europe as a monolith. I think there is very much differentiated opinions even to this question at the moment. So I would say that the most skeptical voices, they traditionally come from countries that traditionally are more for European autonomy. I mean, here, France. So they, of course, are then feel more that they gain more arguments for their long-standing policies. Actually, when something like Greenland happens between the transatlantic within the transatlantic partnership. Then again, Spain, of course, but it is opposing many other measures that the current administration, U.S. administration is pushing through with the increased or heavily increased defense spending and so on. While on the other hand, I would say if you look at the eastern flank countries, the Baltics, Poland, Finland, they have a very much more pragmatic view. And of course, this comes also from their geography and from their needs and from their strong partnership with the United States. And they're just pure understanding that at the moment, unfortunately, going alone without the United States is just not possible. That ways have to be found to preserve this partnership, to strengthen it. Kind of creative thinking is needed to move forward. Another aspect, I think, also it's important to differentiate between public opinion in Europe, which definitely, I think this is something that you can now see that the public opinion toward America is getting worse. But then you have high politics, right? Where some hard wordings, of course, also occur just because all of the politicians, they have to win those elections. And if they feel that the public opinion is shifting, there is kind of a little bit of communication between these two layers. But I think what we hear often in the think tank community when we encounter or when we have visits of European delegations, they always stress that at the working level, there is no such huge fluctuation and that the work is actually ongoing. So I think that, those turbulences, they're sometimes just a part of high politics or just public kind of resistance toward what's going on. But on the working level, I think there's much more stability that sometimes you could think.
I actually would like to just pick up on that last point and just to concur that I think that we're hearing, that from people, as you say, at the working level who are doing the day in, day out relationships, that those continue and that the depth of the cooperation for over decades is there. Now, that's a different story than, as you say, the highly visible aspects, which will also have deep and serious consequences. I do not mean to belittle them, but I guess I want to sort of honor the day-to-day working public servants in multiple countries who are making the alliance function.
Great, thank you. We're getting our first questions from the audience. As mentioned, please feel free to continue to plug questions into the Q&A function on Zoom. This first question: how is Greenland being framed in current security discussions? As a partner, a territory, or a strategic asset, or maybe something else? And how do those narratives shape the policy choices that follow?
One thing I would say, just sitting here in Washington, is that to remember that there's more than one conversation. So there's both what the executive branch would be saying, in its formal channels as through its different channels. But I'd also comment that the other sort of interested parties are members of Congress. We do have a system where members of Congress are part of foreign policy, and it's important to note that I think there's a lot of congressional interest, which is a good thing. I think for people who are serious about the national security of the United States and the allied relations are also following these issues and are see that the United States has the possibility to put bases in Greenland, has since 1951, that this is, and they're asking more very sort of practical questions about what choices should be made, what infrastructure might make sense, and so forth. Again, it's a very sort of practical approach. So I'd like to sort of acknowledge both the congressional and executive branches of government are trying to think about how the United States participates as an ally in the Arctic.
So I think this is really a great question and observation, because I think what the Greenlanders felt, that they just, were put under the spotlight of the world affairs, right, and becoming kind of an object of international relations and geopolitics, while they themselves just live there and want to have their peace and their lives going further, right? But I think this also kind of gives them a leverage, showing that the place they live in is indeed of huge importance, right? And they have the possibility to capitalize on that. And there is now a lot of reporting on Greenland, and of course there are different varying positions of what people think of that situation. But again, just to come back to the infrastructure, right? They have now arguments at hand to attract maybe that political attention that was not there before, because now they have very concrete arguments why this, that, and the third thing should be done, and quickly, right? So while I understand sometimes their sentiment and saying that we don't want to take part in all of this, I think there's also the bright side of the story also to the people living there.
Yeah, and I guess my initial reaction to that question is, why can't it be all three at once? Because I think it is all three at once in some ways. And there's real opportunity, and I'm really glad to see that this conversation has moved into the appropriate diplomatic channels. And I think there's real opportunity to have there be a melding of the minds to show an identification of interests on both sides, defining what the threats are that we need to respond to collectively get after, to identify where we can make co-investment together alongside Europeans, alongside the Danish, us included, whether it be for military or for economic benefit for the collective. So I'm very encouraged by the fact that this is in diplomatic channels right now.
Yeah, agreed. At the Davos World Economic Forum, the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and, in fact, the entire Arctic region, that's a direct quote, was brokered between NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and U.S. President Donald Trump. Afterwards, and since then, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has said that the matter of Greenland is not settled. What is your assessment of the durability of this framework of a future deal? And do you think the deal is sufficient enough for President Donald Trump? Or do you foresee the question of the United States' goal for control over Greenland will reemerge at a later point in the administration? Yeah, Esther.
I think it is possible that it will reemerge, but not with the same fury that we saw this year. I think that the important operations we've just been discussing, both those that have been long held in the Arctic region, plus new things like Arctic Sentry, that those are concrete activities that allies can point to, the U.S. can participate in, that I think change a little bit of the dynamics compared to where we were in January. So I would hope that it would not be the same divisive and furious conversation, that these practical elements might help it be a bit more grounded. But I wouldn't be surprised if it comes up again, but there could be maybe a more grounded conversation about it.
Yeah, I would also say that it's difficult to predict anything, what could happen next tomorrow or even in a couple of minutes. So we live in those times where everything moves very fast, and you can never know what connections kind of can pop up, right? Because of what's ongoing in Iran at the moment, because of maybe that the Trump administration is not really happy with how NATO is contributing or not contributing to what's required in Iran. So there are some possibilities, I think, that this kind of flashes again. But at the same time, I also think that many conditions have changed already since January with the Arctic Century, and the Europeans themselves, they are more aware, I hope now, and planning for different options. So I really hope that in case this reemerges, we have already lessons learned and we can move quicker to negotiate its settlement without kind of prolonged discussions on this high stakes level, where kind of at some point no exit point is in sight.
Yeah, and I'll just add, when Trump talks about Greenland, I hear an emphasis on strategic importance of the region, understanding the changing security dynamics that are happening in the North Atlantic and the Arctic, and making sure that everybody recognizing the changing security dynamics and they're taking ownership of it. Trump wants to act in the U.S. best interest, and I think it's in the best interest of the United States to keep our alliance intact and to defend our interests collectively. I think we saw the fact that there was this agreement with NATO on the margins of Davos as a sign of that. Obviously, the framework itself is a conversation between Denmark and Greenland and the United States, not NATO. And the fact that it's happening in diplomatic channels, I think, is a really good sign. And as I said before, I think there's real opportunity for us to have an understanding and a meeting of the minds.
Yeah, thank you. Our partners and allies are really our comparative advantage. It's something that China and Russia wish that they had the same network of partnerships and alliances that we had. So I think, maintaining and strengthening those alliances and not, falling into infighting, I think is really key. We're coming up on the end of our time. Are there any final remarks, anything that folks would like to mention that they haven't had a chance to? Now would be the time. Yeah, Esther, please.
Well, one of the questions we raised in the task force report on the Arctic several years ago was, what were the sorts of things that could actually the United States should pursue in the Arctic? And I would say that the number one recommendation is still true. And I wouldn't want to miss the opportunity to mention that was ratifying the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which actually would give the United States additional tools for advancing its maritime and global interests, including in the Arctic. And so that although that's unlikely to happen anytime soon, I think we need to keep a perspective on the various diplomatic tools that are available and that need to be part of a broader strategy in the Arctic and worldwide.
Great, thank you.
I would like just to thank for this great conversation. I learned a lot from my co-panelists and from Jason, you yourself. So really great to have been able to participate, and look forward to our future conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for continuing to raise the importance of the Arctic region and to try to highlight where we can have collective benefit where we're on the same page. But thanks.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you all very much for sharing your insights. Thank you to our audience for tuning in, and thank you to the Pacific Council for organizing this webinar. I also learned quite a bit and really appreciate this opportunity to have a frank conversation with you all about the state of Arctic security. Thank you all, and look forward to staying in touch.